Two of the forum started 2 weeks ago or so, though it doesn't necessarily follow on that forum. It's just a different related topic concerning LGBTQ inclusivity and justice. There were some things that we didn't quite get to next week because you all take the message that Lauren preached here very seriously. Questions matter to you, and you asked a lot of them, and so I invite you to ask more of them today if there are things that I can do to help you increase your sense of knowledge and comfort and competency to be a church that takes LGBTQ inclusivity and justice really seriously. Today, instead of starting with all of the information, we did a lot of informational things 2 weeks ago. I want to start with some stories. Because oftentimes when LGBTQ people are talked about in churches, we are talked about as a question. Many churches, many denominations, your own denomination at some point in fairly recent history, and other denominations currently are debating the place of LGBTQ people in those denominations and in congregations. And oftentimes our lives, LGBTQIA people, our lives have been presented as a question. Should we belong? Should we be baptized? Should we be married? Should we be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a story within the church's larger narrative of LGBTQIA faithfulness and courage and love and justice that we often don't hear, mostly because most people don't know the stories. They've been lost, and a lot of really great historians have helped us recover some of those stories. And this is one story of LGBTQIA faithfulness and love and courage and beauty that I want to start with this morning. It was the first time LGBTQ people ever formed a church for themselves to practice inclusivity and justice and the love of God for LGBTQ people. The story went like this. There was a small group of parishioners in a Catholic parish who had each, the LGBTQ parishioners in this parish, had each told their priest about their same-sex attraction, about their questions at the intersection of faith and sexuality, in hopes that that priest might help them to reconcile some of those questions, to embrace them into this community that they belonged to for a really long time, but into the fullness of their being in this community. Instead, this was the priest's pastoral response to his congregants. Each week, when one of the gay or lesbian parishioners would come up the aisle for communion and kneel at the altar rail as the priest was serving the elements to each person along the altar rail, when he came to one of the gay or lesbian parishioners, he would pass them over and serve the next person. Every week, when they approached the altar rail for the table of grace, the priest passed them over and served the next person. These gay and lesbian parishioners, along with some of their straight friends in the congregation, knew exactly what was happening. They were very upset by what was happening. And so this small group of gay and lesbian parishioners left their parish, went down the street, rented space in a hotel lounge, and pulled 2 cocktail tables together in a makeshift altar and started what became known as the Eucharistic Catholic Church. And I often like to ask folks where they think this happened and when they think this happened, because most people who know anything about LGBTQ history in this country would think that this happened probably in the late 60s to the 70s to the 80s, somewhere between Stonewall and the AIDS epidemic in some big gay city like New York or San Francisco or LA. But the Eucharistic Catholic Church began in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia, the heart of the American South. More remarkable than that is that the Eucharistic Catholic Church began as a church where Catholics and Protestants and anyone who didn't have to have a religious affiliation at all to join and have a sense of belonging in that community. It's an expansive community. It began in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia, as a racially integrated congregation of LGBTQ and straight people. how many of you in this room have ever heard that story before? One. Wow, terrific. That's more than almost any other audience I ever tell this story to. Most people have never. Can I ask you where you heard this?
It was at Luther Seminary when we had that seminar.
So you heard it from me.
Yeah, I guess.
That's great. Thank you. I'm glad that you remembered the story and it stuck with you. Most of the time, even when I'm talking to a group of gay lesbian clergy, they've never heard this story. So I like to tell this story as many times as I can to as many audiences as possible, because this is a story that belongs to LGBTQ people. This is the story of our ancestors in the faith. People who were not satisfied to sit on the sidelines, to be pushed to the margins, to accept the restricting dictates of the status quo, and who did something bold, something audacious, something courageous, something rooted in love and justice in order to practice the gospel. And we don't know these stories. And these are the stories I think queer and trans people need in order to boost our own sense of who we are in this larger church's narrative. We aren't just questions of inclusivity or exclusivity, questions about whether someone belongs or not, etc. We are examples, exemplars in some situations, of really incredible expressions of love and justice. And I tell this story because this story belongs to the church. In many ways, LGBTQ people's stories within the church have been excised from the larger narrative, not often maliciously, because many churches that are affirming of LGBT people, that are led by LGBTQ people, still don't know these stories because there has not been a conduit to pass them down to us. They're stories that are rarely, if ever, told from the pulpit or from the lectern or in the forums. So I start with that story because it's important to start with a story of pride, a story of love, a story of courage when we talk about LGBTQ people. Because our lives are not totalized by the problems we face that we talked about last time. For example, the 515 laws that are being considered that have been considered this year in legislatures to deny our rights and to charge us for injustice and things of that nature. Those are important. But equally or more important are these stories of love and justice and courage and faith. Anything that brings up for you that you want to name right now before we move on a bit?
Any idea if that pastor or that church has changed its view? I mean,
Well, it's a Catholic church. The original one, you mean? Yeah.
Does it still exist?
I don't know about that. I don't know about the original church they left. But the Eucharistic Catholic Church doesn't exactly exist anymore, but there is a church in Canada that traces its lineage back to the Eucharistic Catholic Church. And it was later led, at first it was a lay-led organization. They left their parish and started this church, but later a man named George Hyde, who was a Catholic priest, came to lead that congregation for a really long time. He was an early advocate for LGBTQ inclusion within the Roman Catholic Church, and of course, got into a lot of trouble for that.
I was going to say, so he kicked out.
Yeah, I can't quite remember the trajectory of his career. He didn't become bishop or anything, but yeah, but courageous figure himself. Anything else that brings up for you or questions that you'd like to raise before we move on to that?
Tom says one question. Is it, are there still gay-only churches? When I was in seminary, there was a metropolitan community.
Yeah.
Some of those students were at seminary because they didn't have one, So
Yeah.
does that still exist? Are there still, because more churches are more welcoming, more people have just given up, is my perception.
That's a good question. What seminary was this?
Christ Seminary Center.
Oh.
The break-off.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, yes, there are. Just wanted to check it out. Or were you going to speak to this?
Respond to her question.
Oh, go ahead.
There's all that children, which is 2 blocks away.
Okay, and then that's a denomination, or is it just like a local?
MCC.
Yes, MCC.
It's the same,
I was a
same,
member there for many years.
okay. So that church still exists? That's
That
the one I
church
was
still
just mentioning.
exists.
Cool.
So this, well, I was going to wait until the story later, but since we're telling stories and it goes with this question, let me tell that story. That story goes like this. There was a Pentecostal minister named Troy Perry who had a really long season of wrestling with really deep questions about his sexuality and faith. Really to the point of despair in many instances of his story. It was a story where he could have given up in many different ways, left the ministry, left his life. But he came to the point of reconciling his sense of sexuality with his faith and sense of call to ministry. And if you read his story, there's some really good documentation of his story, much more so than the early Eucharistic Catholic Church, because he's still living. A lot of people are really interested in his story. If you read the story, it's so reminiscent of the struggles of prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Struggling with their sense of call, struggling with their identity, struggling with their sense of relationship with God, and following this sense of call that they had. So Troy Perry decided that he was going to stay in ministry. He was going to embody this sense of call to ministry that he had been embodying for so long, and he was going to do it as an openly gay man. So this is what he did. The Advocate magazine, probably still the largest LGBT magazine in the country, he took out an ad in the Advocate. And he said, anyone who wants to join me for worship, come to my living room. Gave his address in Los Angeles on such and such a date, 1968, and we will have a worship service. 12 people showed up to his living room for the first worship service of what became the Metropolitan Community Churches. What I think is really interesting about this story, though, is that Troy Perry thought in 1968 that this would be a 2-year experiment, because within about 2 years, all the mainline denominations would come around and embrace LGBTQ. 1968, and of course those struggles are still going on in mainline denominations. But from those 12 people in that living room in LA in 1968, the MCC grew into the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history. The largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history wasn't a social justice organization, a rights advocacy organization. It was a church. You see what I mean when I say our stories have been excerpted, excised, left out of the larger church's narrative? How many of you knew that the largest grassroots movement of LGBTQ people was a church? Not only this, the first building ever owned by an LGBTQ organization was the Metropolitan Community Church's sanctuary that they built in the 70s in LA. And the MCC, unlike the Eucharistic Catholic Church, does still continue to this day. Of course, there's a church here in Minneapolis that you belong to. You see?
I used to.
Yeah.
I used to.
Oh, really? Wow. Yeah. And it's a real struggle, I think, of identity for churches like MCC churches. Now, I want you to be clear that there are a lot of places in the U.S. where the MCC is the only LGBTQ affirming church in town, or in the city, or in the county. Not every place is the Twin Cities, where there are many LGBTQ affirming churches. So in some places, the MCC church has a particularly important role because they're a haven for LGBTQ people to this day. I think in a lot of cities like this one, in Boston where I came from, the MCC church has sometimes struggled with its sense of identity and place because there are more and more churches that are LGBTQ affirming and that are led by LGBTQ people. And sadly, the MCC church in Boston, which was one of the original kind of historic congregations, I preached there many times when I lived in Boston, did just close about 2 or 3 months ago because the congregation had dwindled quite a bit. And even a lot of the members in the congregation that met in the evening were also members of other churches in the morning. And so there are sort of struggles with that sense of identity. I don't think, however, that it's, let me just say, I've heard from well-meaning Christian folk that they hope that one day there's no more need for the MCC or something like that, you know. And I get what they're saying. They hope that LGBTQ people can find a home in any congregation that they wish to belong to. And we should all wish for that and work for that. But I also think that there are particularly important roles that an LGBTQ-centric congregation can play in the larger life of faith, even if other congregations are also embracing LGBTQ people's gifts and calls. For one, there are places where some of these stories have been and are being preserved and told. And for many people, you know, myself included, growing up in a place where I knew no other LGBTQ person until I was in college, knew no church that was LGBTQ affirming. I had heard of the MCC church. There wasn't one where I lived, but I had heard of it. And knowing that it was there was hopeful for me as a queer teenager in Southern Baptist, upstate South Carolina, to know that there was a church where I could belong. And of course, that was also the case when I found out, oh, there's a Baptist church in Charlotte, and they have LGBTQ people. And there's a Baptist church in Atlanta that's been ordaining LGBTQ people. Even if I'd never been there, knowing that churches like this were there was so vital to me growing up in very similar kind of struggles between my own sexuality and sense of faith. Good question. Prompted a long story, but yes, they are still around. Anything else that raises before we move on? We could probably just roll with questions for the whole time and get a lot of good conversation in.
Everyone here is real shy.
Yes, I understand that. Yeah.
Well, is part of the problem that we're still operating out of medieval science rather than the new physics and cosmology? For instance, we're evolving. I mean, science is saying that we're evolving, and that we involve, one of the part of our evolution is more complexity. And if we believe what Jesus taught us, said that, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he was saying that there is a place where God exists like no other place, and that's in the human. And that every human is an expression of Christ. Jesus was the Christ, and Christ is in everybody. And that we don't, and they're not, I mean, I'm bothered by differences. I grew up with differences, and I'm still bothered by people who, it still bothers me to see people same sex or what have you, you know. I'm very uncomfortable with it. But is that part of my refusal to see the Christ in them? That they are just another expression of the complexity. I mean, you look at nature, Christ was first incarnated in nature, so there's such a variety within nature, it boggles the mind. And then every human being is like a snowflake. There's no snowflake alike. No human being is alike. We all have differences.
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase that question. It's phrased from a posture of compassionate curiosity rather than suspicion and scrutiny. You recognize your own internalized sort of prejudices and biases, but you are wondering beyond them what could be revealed of Christ in the world.
That's what we get the eyes of faith, and Jesus was able to see the divine in every human being.
Yeah.
And to the point he could forgive the very people that were killing him. And so that's a different, those are different eyes. But it's not that it's foreign to me, it's in me. If Christ is in me, then that I have those eyes.
Gosh, thank you. Yeah, that's really beautiful. Yeah, I'm going to build on that a little bit because I think this is getting at something that so this whole forum is about moving beyond just affirmation about LGBTQ people. Affirmation being that, this church, the LCA, et cetera, has come to a place of affirming that LGBTQ people are created in the image of God and their ordinations are seen as holy and valid, just like straight peoples and things of that nature. And affirmation is really, really important. It's good to be able to move those boundaries that we have had erected for so long to keep people out and expand them a bit to include more people in. But I do want to suggest that there are some limitations to the kinds of questions that lead to affirmation. They serve a really important purpose, greater inclusivity for LGBTQ people in the structures of churches and denominations, etc. What you're moving us to, I think, is a posture of compassionate curiosity, which asks something a little different. Compassionate curiosity doesn't ask who should belong here, who should be ordained, who should be a member, who should, etc. Compassionate curiosity asks, what could we learn from LGBTQIA people if we looked at their lives as sources of sacred wisdom? Or, like you phrased the question, if we looked at their lives through the eyes of Christ, the Christ that is within me and within them. I realized the power of this question one time, probably 15 years ago now, when I was invited to talk at a Baptist conference on sexuality and covenant, and the question that was posed to me was, what are the boundaries of covenant? So I understood the assignment. It was to come and make a defense for why LGBTQ people should be able to be in covenanted marital relationships with one another. And I could not muster the imagination or energy to do that again. It is a stifling kind of question to have to always go and make a defense for why you should be at the table, ordained, married, etc. But I already accepted the invitation. So I came to the place, 500 Baptists in this wonderful church in Atlanta, from all over the country. And instead I asked them to consider, what could churches learn about covenanted relationships from LGBTQ people? Because LGBTQ people have been forming covenanted relationships, intimate partnerships, marriages, at the margins of their churches, at the margins of societies and the legal structures recognition, at the margins of their family, for generations. And we have learned things about what it means to sustain community and to sustain relationship at the margins of the communities that have pushed us out, or left us out, or said we can't belong. So that was the talk that I gave at that place. It opened up some imaginative space for me to lean into some different questions, not questions that were posed to me, but questions that I wanted to address, that mattered to me about LGBTQ people. And so that's one of the movements I want to invite you into. Affirmation is really important. And I don't know the entire history, but this church at some point decided LGBTQ people belonged here in every way that someone could belong in a church. But moving beyond that, what have you, Mount Olive Lutheran Church, learned about life, about faith, about love, about justice from LGBTQ people? Another way of asking that question, and I might give you just a couple of minutes to talk to your neighbor about this. What would you have missed out on, Mount Olive Lutheran Church? What would you have missed out on if you hadn't said, yes, of course, LGBTQ people belong here, and their gifts are welcomed here, and their sense of call is recognized here? I don't even know when that happened in the life of this church. But if you hadn't done that, what would you have missed out on that you have learned, things that have blessed your life and faith from the lives of LGBTQ people? We take like 3 minutes and turn to the person beside you.
Quickly, does anyone remember when we became a Reconciling in Christ congregation?
About 1999 was the official, but the discussions were going on well before that, but that's when the official
Before that.
RSC.
Before that,
80s.
1991, 92 was when
So 34 years or so.
But there was discussion in the 80s also.
Wow, so 40 years or so.
Keep going.
Wow. So this is the kind of story that I think also, I can't do this work with you in this hour, but this is the kind of work that also needs to be done to preserve the stories of this church's journey to recognize the beauty and gift of LGBTQ people. Maybe there are some folks who know how to collect stories like that and can write those down. And when you do that, let me just name this, when you do that, don't just tell the story based upon the arguments and the questions that you were asking. Tell the story of the LGBTQ people who were here, who stuck through some really difficult times when you were asking some questions that probably weren't great questions to ask, but you moved through it as a community. And now I want you to just for a moment turn to one another and talk about the gifts that you have experienced from LGBTQ people in this place and what you've learned from them in the last 40 years or so. Only a couple of minutes, so just turn to someone beside you and talk about what that
Yeah, whatever.
All right, can I call you back together for a minute?
I've been aware about all this
Class, can I call you back together? I want to hear some of what Just very briefly, we don't have time to hear all the conversations that went on in the room, but very briefly, what did you hear in those conversations that surprised you, that caused you joy, that was a really good thing to recall? What did you hear that you'd like for others to hear that surprised you or brought you joy?
Mark's video.
Yeah.
Well, say more, some of us weren't here then.
Well,
We wouldn't have had the musical gifts of Mark's video. Looking at it negatively.
Yeah.
He did a lot for us.
Yeah, and I was here last week with a friend from Boston and was surprised when he showed up and played the post. Yeah.
I have a story to tell, and maybe we'll go on. When they were voting, there was a kid that when they were voting on the seats of congregation, we had a member here, Muriel Jackson. And she was one of the very prominent members. And then after several Sunday meetings, they decided to vote on that. And before they voted, she raised her hand, correct me if I'm wrong, people, but she raised her hand and said, I just don't understand what we're doing here. She said, I don't even know a gay person. And she's sitting next to Don Hedman, and they had been in their home. And so I don't think it mattered to people for so much. You know, I mean, it just, we were around, you know, and accepted.
Yeah.
We have to know that burial, burial Jasper, that we could name the hospitality. I mean, she was the kitchen lady, and she was the one who always directed us and served. And that's who he's referring to. You know, I mean, it's just that who can say a particular time? And I thank Jean for recognizing this.
There's another moment, and, the name escapes me, but we used to write the letter column. When Dean started going to the church, Mary, Mary Lee met them at the door, welcomed him, and she said to Steve, so what do you do? And he said, I write a letter column for Upper Magazine. And she had all kinds of questions about how he did that column. It wasn't what, you know, no, it's curious.
Yeah.
It was a welcome.
It's a great story. And you know, that is often taught the way that this kind of thing happens. It's not just about questions and issues of where to draw boundaries. It's about people that we know and that we love and that we lean into their lives with curiosity rather than suspicion and scrutiny and grow into that way.
I think Gary and I have been members here since 1990, so 34 years. That's a fair length of time in this congregation. When we joined the congregation, there were a number of gay men and maybe one or two lesbians, I think. And we were always welcome. However, I think that the presence of LGBTQ people in this congregation early on did some sifting in the congregation's attempt to identify itself. And there are, I think, some factors that played into that. Among them, the fact that this was an English Synod congregation, so a little more independent. Among them, the fact that when Missouri blew up in the 70s, this congregation knew they had to leave. Among them, the fact that this congregation and its leadership understood from the beginning that from our beginning here, that all people are children of God. There is no white heterosexual more blessed than the rest. Nonetheless, there were some difficult times during those early years of our presence. Gary and I never felt as though we didn't belong. We never felt as though we were excluded. And I'm aware of people who left because there were getting to be too many gay people here and they didn't want their children exposed to that. The congregation insistently said,
Yeah, powerful story. And ways in which the stories of warmth and inclusivity and hospitality and relationality are sometimes interwoven with stories of pain and stories of departure. Another thing that you bring up that I think is really important is when we tell the story of the church's coming to affirmation of LGBTQ people, we often tell that story in isolation from every other part of the church's story. So whenever I've worked with churches on this journey of affirmation in some way, I usually start by helping them tell the story of the church that led up to this becoming a question at all. Because there were many things that led up to that. Sometimes it's the presence of LGBTQ people in the church and a request, for example, to be married. And no one thought about that before, so now we have to have a question, some sense of discernment about this. But oftentimes there are other ways in which congregations have made really bold, faithful stands on some kind of concern. that are part of the story of leading up to LGBTQ affirmation, and the story of LGBTQ affirmation and justice is leading toward other similar bold stands for faith and justice and love. I'll tell you just briefly, my congregation back in Cambridge became affirming, a really incredible story for a Baptist congregation, I think. When I started to help them to tell the story, their story began, well, didn't begin here, but one of the precursor stories to LGBTQ affirmation was that they were practicing sanctuary with undocumented people. And we're part of the network of sanctuary churches in the 80s that were doing this. Really incredible, beautiful stories of faithfulness. The church got broken into a lot, their files tampered with and destroyed. At some point, they came to know that they had an informant in the congregation, an FBI informant, and they started to pray for their informant every Sunday morning. Many years later, they filed a FOIA request, and when they got the documents, lots of stuff was redacted, and they asked why, and they said it was to protect the identity of the informant. So there had been an informant in the congregation the whole time they were holding this woman and her children in sanctuary. But they say that is what helped them to realize that LGBTQ people also needed a sanctuary. And they became an LGBTQ affirming congregation that has now had 40 years of lesbian and gay pastors because they were practicing their faith through sanctuary with undocumented people and opened their imaginations and their hearts to other forms of sanctuary for people who, in the 1980s, I mean, a time when LGBTQ, well, gay men especially, were just dying in droves. They needed a sanctuary, and this church became that during that era. Those stories exist here too. We started when you were telling the story, trying to pinpoint a date when you came to this story, this point of affirmation. But there are things that came before that, and things that came before that, and things that came before that that are the arc of your congregation's narrative. So if you start digging through and uncovering these stories, see how this story is related to other stories, and also how this story is related to stories that are still to come, and acts of faithfulness and inclusivity and justice that you haven't even imagined yet. Just want to share something?
This is like second or third or fourth hand, and those who knew the Jasters probably have had it better. But what I was told is that Warren Jasper was originally a member here back in the 50s, and Elmer, mixing people up. And he was divorced. He and his wife were divorced while they were members here. But, and in that time, that in many churches said, you know, goodbye, you can't be here anymore. But Mount Olive embraced him, and when he remarried his wife, his second wife. And when we started having discussions about gay members in our midst, whatever, what I was told is that Elmer's comment was that, you know, this congregation embraced me after my divorce instead of rejecting me. Can I do anything different in this instance? So, and that has always stood out to me, whether the story is apocryphal or not. But I think it gets at Mount Olive's history, as Warren was saying, in the, you know, going from English Synod to the Seminacts and on, and that just builds.
Linda, I don't think that was Jaster's, they were divorced.
No,
But it was Schroeder.
it was
Yeah.
Schroeder.
Oh, okay. So-
Oh,
And
interesting.
the
Good, thanks for
congregation told
correcting
the
that.
Missouri Synod, we don't care what you do, but we're keeping this man.
Wow. Okay, we did wow.
That
Yeah.
It does make me
Yeah, one more.
I just think about what, like, when you say what would we have missed or whatever. You know, my boys learned justice, inclusivity, and love from Andrew Anderson when he led the youth group. And it has changed, it has influenced their, you know, their 40s now. And, you know, I just thank God for Andrew leading the youth group in such an affirming way.
Thank you.
I don't want to miss that.
Yeah, so many stories that I imagine you don't want other people to miss, stories that you told to your partner here. And I would encourage you to figure out ways of getting together and telling these stories, you know, in groups, because you can remember things about a story that the other person has forgotten and construct a bit of a narrative that needs to be preserved and celebrated. I want to talk just a bit about this little list that we didn't get to last week, but that I want to go through briefly in the last 10 minutes or so we have. So these are steps beyond affirmation. And we won't have time to get into each one very in depth, but I think they're important to at least name, and you can take them and do with them what you wish. One is proclaiming your affirmation in ways that LGBT people can easily understand. This is something I talk about with every single church that I talk to about these concerns. And there's one story that still lives within me that prompts me to kind of make it an ethical obligation of myself to talk about this point. I did my dissertation research on LGBTQ suicide and the ways that religious and spiritual narratives come to constitute a sense of self for LGBT people sometimes, leading up to suicidality, and then how they worked with those narratives in the aftermath of surviving. And I interviewed a man named Thomas, who was about 50 when I interviewed him. He had had a suicide attempt in his 20s and had left the church that he belonged to that had consistently proclaimed his abomination. Thomas had been without a church for the 30 years or so between a suicide attempt and our interview. And he had been working out his own faith all by himself during that time. And in such rich ways that at the end of our interview, I said, Thomas, it sounds like you have read a lot of queer theology. And Thomas said, what is queer theology? Thomas didn't know there was anybody writing about this. He didn't know that there were any churches that were LGBTQ affirming. He had been working out his own faith by himself, without any companionship, without any congregation to support him for 3 decades. And the faith that produced was beautiful. But what sticks with me is that Thomas was telling me this story in a city where there were at least half a dozen or more LGBTQ affirming congregations. There were 3 or 4 within a few blocks from where we sat in that interview. And he did not know that they were there because they had never done anything to publicly proclaim their affirmation for LGBTQ people so that someone like Thomas could find them. Some of these churches had things like welcoming and affirming on their sign, but no one knows what that means. Some had reconciling in Christ, more like if you're Presbyterian, but no one outside of those denominations know what those words mean. So I think about someone like Thomas, and I know that there are people in every city where there are churches all over the place that are LGBTQ affirming, but the queer and trans people in those cities haven't found those churches. Even some are looking for them, but many like Thomas would have loved to have been a part of a church like that. Unfortunately, in that week, he had just discovered the Lutheran church in that city was affirming, and he had started going there. That week, he had just discovered that. So I say this so that you can think about your public proclamation of affirmation. How many layers on the website does someone need to dig through to figure out that you're affirming of LGBTQ people? What signs could someone see in your literature, in your, on your lawn or wherever, that this is a place where LGBT people belong and are celebrated? My church in Cambridge had a big lawn on Massachusetts Avenue in Harvard Square, so thousands of people walking by every day, and I used to sit out on the bench in the front lawn and listened to people as they walked by the church and saw whatever signage we had out at that point. Sometimes it was LGBTQ lives are sacred, trans lives are beautiful. Sometimes it was messages about Muslim justice or immigration or whatever. And hearing people as they passed by this Baptist church and saw rainbow flags or messages of immigration justice or whatever, it was just so astounding and heartening to hear what those messages meant to people. And people showed up on Sunday morning because they saw something outside the church that indicated that they wanted to know more about what was inside the church. And oftentimes, it wasn't LGBTQ people, it was straight and cisgender people who said, I don't want to go to a church where my brother can't come with me when he visits town because he's gay. Or I don't want to go to church where my friends or classmates are not going to feel comfortable going. So this is important on a number of different levels, but the most important for me ethically is being sure that LGBTQ people know there are places where they can belong unquestioningly. Develop your knowledge and competency related to gender identity. We talked about this a lot last week. I just want to name this as a growing edge for nearly every affirming church that I've ever worked with. We often do a lot to understand sexual orientation, but need to go a little further to understand gender identity. I won't talk more about this because we spent a lot of time on it last week, but I'll recommend some books at the end. Getting involved in LGBTQ rights on a local level. You live in a state that has, in many instances, enshrined LGBTQ rights in the legal structures of this state. We're a haven in the upper Northwest, a place where a lot of LGBTQ people are coming for that haven, especially trans people coming for gender-affirming care in this area. But there are always threats to LGBTQ rights. You saw the map last week that I showed you of the 515 laws that were being debated this year in state legislatures across the country, including Minnesota, that target LGBTQ people. I don't believe any of those passed in Minnesota this year. They did in many other states. But figure out ways of getting involved at a local level. Outfront Minnesota is a really important organization doing some of that work, and they have a faith community organizer that you could connect with. His name is Matt Llewellyn Otten. Really wonderful guy who's organizing faith communities in relation to local and state level rights issues. That was a little hard to see, but uncover and regularly tell the stories of queer and trans faithful. This is what we've been doing this morning with the story of the Eucharistic Catholic Church, the story of the MCC. Not letting these stories get subjugated under the larger church's narrative, because these are stories that belong to the church, and they're stories that belong to queer and trans people, and they need someone to be the conduit to pass these stories down to us. Developing trauma-aware care across intersecting identities and lifespans. So this is understanding the ways that LGBTQ people who are coming through the doors of this church may have experienced a lot of religious, spiritual trauma and abuse in other places in their lives. This is also looking at, intersecting identities with race and gender and class, sexual orientation, etc. A lot of helpful resources for this that I can recommend later on. Practice a posture of compassionate curiosity to learn from queer lives. This is what we've been talking about with developing our questions out of that place of compassion and curiosity rather than suspicion and scrutiny. And then ask, and this is really important here, even though I don't know that we quite want to talk about it yet. What will you risk to protect LGBTQ plus lives in the coming season? We are entering a political season where our lives, our rights, our well-being are going to increasingly be under attack. So this is the question that I think churches that have proclaimed their affirmation for LGBTQ people need to ask in this next political season. What will you risk of your own comfort? What will you risk of your own assets? What will you risk to protect LGBTQ lives in this coming season, where that map that I showed you last week is just going to continue to be a problem for us. Let's not get into that. 5 minutes, what does this raise to you, for you, that you would like to talk about a little bit before we end?
To share a story, years ago, we had a vicar here, a lesbian woman, who we all, we loved, and gosh, her name escapes me now, and she has recently died. She got cancer. And
Jean.
what? Jean, yes. And everything. Again, we liked her so much, and everything. Her final sermon here, something she did and said, always stuck with me. She says, Mount Olive is such a beautiful haven for this community and for the people that are looking and searching for that. And you can kind of rest on your laurels for that if you want. But she said, is that enough? Is that enough? Should you just be happy with what you are? And is that enough? What are you going to do about that? And that challenge that she gave that day stuck with me, because I thought, yeah, you're a great place, but is that enough?
Yeah, it's powerful.
It was very cool.
And we can think about that question on a whole lot of different levels, not just with LGBTQ people, but all the ways that we have been faithful, or that you have been faithful in the past, have led you to this point. And there are increasing challenges, different challenges, new ways in which you are being summoned into faithfulness again. And I can't answer for you what those ways are, but you in discernment will figure out that is not enough what you've done before, and what you're going to do is going to be as important and as beautiful and as, in many ways, life-saving as the things that you've done in the past.
I think it poses all this. I mean, I think anyway, okay, what would we want to protect in this church? We love this beautiful building. That, I mean, to think that somebody would bring destruction to this building. I mean, that's, and I think, that may sound like a selfish thing, but what is out there? What is out there that's going on? I mean, insults are limited, but threat of life, are we going to be adopted where somebody comes in with them because we're known as, what is out there? I think we just have to focus on what we value and just go to that and know that we have a community that can move to another building. We are established as a congregation, and I think that's a value.
Yeah. So one thing I hear from this that I want to lift up is that amid fear, your orientation is not toward protecting things, but it's rooting yourself into your deepest held values and turning toward one another in community. That is a beautiful expression in the midst of an increasingly fearful society in many ways. Rooted in your deepest held values and turning toward one another in community. David, and then a couple more of you.
Our puritanical basis for this country has made anything that has to do with the biology of sex ooky. We don't want to talk about it. And I think when it comes to that's one of the main reasons why there is so much opposition, and this growing opposition, is because it's not what I do, so I can't imagine what anybody else does, and I don't want to think about what they do. But it's this limitation of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people into what they do in bed. It's just bringing it down to this kind of laser focus. And that's, I remember having a conversation with my mother. At that point, we had an openly gay lesbian vicar as well. And she one day went on this rant about, this is bad. Finally I said, Mother, what do you I said, did you decide that she thought she just got up one morning and said, I'll mow the lawn, do the dishes, and I'll become a lesbian today. And she, well, no, I don't think that. And I went, and besides, all you're doing is reducing Jody and her partner to what they do in bed. That's your focus. And I said, I don't think any of us want to be reduced to that as our relationship. And my dad spoke up and said, that's for sure. So, that was one of my dad's shining moments, let me tell you. But I do, I think we can't, we've all got genitals, and we get all weirded out by what other people do with them. And it impacts then everything else. That's simplistic, I think, maybe, but.
We got a question here. Yeah.
To your last point, get out and vote.
Yeah.
Even if you don't agree with either party or binary, write somebody in, because we need to get out and vote. I had a lunch with a friend of mine Friday, and she wasn't going to vote. And I said, Karen, you've got to vote. Write in, she said, I'll write your name in. And I said, fine, but get out and vote. And by the time we talked, then she came around to the person that I think I ought to vote for. But the point being, get out and vote and try to get people out and vote. That's what we've got to do.
2 more quick comments and we'll wrap up.
Well, I think it helps to realize that we're all affected. And we didn't get a lot of time to talk about the benefits that we've seen from being affirming. But for me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, one of the big benefits has been that gay and lesbian relationships sort of allowed the rest, or created more space in the rest of society for reimagining gender roles. Roles within a relationship, roles within ourselves. And, we talked last time about the different aspects of gender and presentation and how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world and all of those different aspects, and how, we can be a 7 on this spectrum and a 3 on that one and a 5 on that one. But each have our unique understanding of ourselves and our unique aspects of what abilities and interests and attributes are ours from across the spectrum. And that's of benefit to all of us. And even those who are, most comfortable with heterosexual, cis-normative understanding benefit from asking the question to Lauren's sermon today. It's very appropriate. Rather than just defaulting to whatever framework is handed down as this is how a woman is supposed to be and this is how a man is supposed to be. If that's how you're most comfortable, great. But it's especially great if you have chosen that for yourself. You may ask the question and decided, yes, that is who I am. Or, maybe you're not. But I think it's been of benefit to all of us to ask those questions and come to those understandings in whatever unique configuration is appropriate for ourselves.
And that's one of the dangers of questions. The reason that people are resistant to them is because they call into question, except, for example, the kind of patriarchal norms of our society that we're now seeing legal battles to try to shore up the patriarchal norms by targeting LGBTQ people through, excising us from the curriculum.
We have skin in that game.
Don't say gay laws and things of that nature. People are afraid of questions in many ways, and looking at what the, not asking those questions is protecting is a really helpful piece of it, I think. One more and we'll wrap up.
Yes, I think we have to recognize too that we cannot separate these things out. We cannot say, well, we're gonna let the LGBTQ stuff go because other things are more important. The problem is the opposition is lumping them all together and they're gonna go after them anyway. And we have a problem here. I don't know how much people in this room know about Project 2025, but it has a plan for imposing a state religion on this country that would forbid almost everything we do in this building. It's an extreme form of Protestantism. I've often been bothered by Lutherans who don't seem to understand that Lutherans aren't really Protestants in the United States. Even though the term was originally applied to Lutherans in Europe. Because in the United States, the prevailing idea of Protestantism is Calvinism in some form. And these days, it's a very rigid form of Calvinism that some people are trying to force us on us. And in many respects, a corrupted form of Calvinism, I should say, too, in fairness to the Calvinists. And so, you know, it's not just a matter of who we tolerate within our walls, but what we practice when we're here.
Yeah.
One more, we'll
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add on to his thoughts about Project 2025, that, and to the last point there, I think, depending how things go in the next few years, this church may be faced asking what level of risk we go too high and to help people escape who may be persecuted by different states or governments in this country. You know, we already see, I go on Reddit and into the Minnesota subreddits, and half of the posts are, I'm trans and I live in Texas. Is Minnesota a good state to move to? You know, it's already happened.
Yeah, and this is the kind of question that my church was asking when we were practicing sanctuary with undocumented people in the 80s, and then figured out there were other things that we also needed to risk for other people. And naming white Christian nationalism as one of the major threats to democracy, to religious freedom, etc. is a really important one. I'm teaching a white Christian nationalism class at Luther.
I'm aware of the time, and could you stay for a couple minutes and answer questions, or do you need to get going?
No, I can stick around. I was just going to wrap up and say, if you want to come up here and chat, I'm glad to do that.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so let's do that. Let the people that want to get up and go. But I want to say thank you very much, Cody, again for being here. Right.